Bob Stinson would never have survived, not in the long run. His genius was too wild, his pain too deep, and his self-destruction almost fatal. For a brief, glorious moment, he was the chaotic heart of the Replacements. He was the reason they were great and the reason they could never become the biggest stars. Legend has it that alcohol and drugs are to blame. But those are just symptoms. What is the real disease? And when a person is destined to burn out, what else can those around them do but watch the flames? To understand Bob Stinson, you have to understand that the unhinged, unpredictable character he played on stage wasn't an act. It was an escape. And what he was escaping was a childhood so dark, so steeped in violence and fear, that the beautiful, glorious train wreck of the Replacements was the safest place he had ever known. Imagine Minneapolis in the 1970s. This wasn't the hip, artistic city it would become. This was a landscape of blue-collar grit, of factories and unforgiving winters that seemed to last half the year. It was a place where you kept your head down, worked your shift, and didn't expect much more. Dreams were a luxury most couldn't afford. In a small house in this city lived the Stinson family, and inside that house was a private, unspoken hell. The family was a fractured unit, patched together by remarriage, and ruled by a stepfather whose presence filled the home with a constant simmering dread. According to those who knew the family, particularly Bob's half-sister Anita, their stepfather was a violent and abusive man. For Bob, who was a sensitive and somewhat awkward kid, the home was not a sanctuary. It was a place of terror. He endured years of what his sister would later describe as horrific physical and psychological abuse. This isn't just a grim backstory. It is the key that unlocks the entire man. Every bizarre outfit, every reckless act, every drink taken to excess can be traced back to the terror of that house. The frantic energy, the compulsive need to be the clown, the deep dive into alcohol and drugs. It wasn't just rock and roll excess. It was a desperate, lifelong attempt to outrun the ghosts. It was a set of coping mechanisms learned by a child trying to survive an unbearable reality. But in that house of horrors, there was one person Bob Stinson was determined to protect, his little half-brother, Tommy. Tommy was 9 years younger, a small, quiet kid in a dangerous world. Bob, barely a teenager himself, took on the role of fierce protector. He became Tommy's shield, absorbing the worst of the abuse to keep it from his little brother. And his greatest act of protection was the one that would accidentally change music history. Fearing for Tommy's safety, wanting to get him out of the house and away from their stepfather's rage, Bob devised a plan. It was a rescue mission set to a punk rock beat. He would start a band, and he would put his little brother in it. The only problem was Tommy didn't know how to play an instrument. So, in an act of what you might call delinquent genius, Bob stole a bass guitar from a local music shop. He brought it home and began teaching his 11-year-old brother, note by painstaking note, in the quiet corners of their chaotic home. Think about that for a moment. The Replacements, a band that would become legendary for their who cares attitude, was born from an act of profound, desperate care. They weren't chasing fame or fortune. They were started by a brother trying to save his sibling. He gave Tommy a reason to be out of the house, a place to belong, a world to escape into. He gave him the band. They recruited a neighborhood drummer, Chris Mars, whose own troubled home life made him a kindred spirit. The final piece of the puzzle was a singer-songwriter who worked as a janitor, a brilliantly cynical and secretly romantic kid named Paul Westerberg. Paul was drawn to the Stinson brothers' chaotic energy. They were everything he wasn't. Loud, fearless, and seemingly immune to embarrassment. Together, they called themselves the Replacements, and their early sound was a perfect reflection of their origins. Pure, frantic, basement-level energy. They were a mess, but they were a beautiful mess. Their first gigs were in crowded basements, fueled by cheap beer. They were fast, loud, and gloriously sloppy. At the center of it all, driving the chaos and giving it its unhinged soul, was Bob Stinson. On stage, he was a spectacle. He'd wear anything from a security guard's uniform to a plaid skirt to a ballerina's tutu. He was less a guitar player and more a performance artist who happened to have a guitar strapped to him. His solos were legendary. They were not technical marvels of precision. They were explosions of pure feeling. He would attack the instrument, wrenching out sounds that were sometimes brilliant, sometimes disastrous, but always, always honest. He played like a man with nothing to lose because in many ways he felt he'd already lost everything. The band quickly earned a reputation, first locally, then nationally, as the best and worst live band in America. You never knew what you were going to get. One night, they could be the tightest, most passionate rock and roll band on the planet, playing with a sincerity that could make you cry. The next night, they would be a drunken shambles, falling over each other, playing sloppy covers of songs they barely knew, and getting banned from the club. This thrilling unpredictability was their curse, but it was also their magic. At the heart of it was a growing tension. Paul Westerberg's songs were becoming more sophisticated and heartbreakingly poignant, while Bob Stinson remained committed to pure, unapologetic chaos. For a while, that friction created sparks of undeniable genius. On their 1984 masterpiece, Let It Be, they achieved a perfect, precarious balance. Westerberg's songs of youthful alienation and tender heartbreak were given a raw, visceral power by the band's ragged delivery, and Bob's wild, melodic, and utterly unique guitar playing was the secret ingredient. Just listen to his work on that album. On Unsatisfied, he provides a beautifully chiming, almost elegant guitar line that perfectly captures the song's aching heart. Then on a song like Gary's Got a Boner, he's a barely controlled force of nature, all jagged edges and manic energy. He could be both the beauty and the beast, sometimes in the very same song. But as the band's ambitions grew, that balance began to crumble. Westerberg was evolving into one of the great songwriters of his generation, and he wanted his songs to be heard. He wanted success. He would bring a quiet, vulnerable ballad to the band, and Bob, in his mind, would try to set it on fire. The drunken antics that were once charming were now becoming a liability. Bob's substance abuse, his primary tool for managing his deep-seated trauma, was spiraling further out of control. He was becoming more and more erratic, missing rehearsals, showing up to recording sessions or live gigs in no condition to play. The recording of their 1985 album, Tim, produced by Tommy Ramone, brought these tensions to a boiling point. It was their first brush with a major label and their chance to make a more focused, professional record. But professionalism was the last thing on Bob's mind. He clashed with the producer and with Paul. The very chaos that he had brought to the band, the same untamed energy that made them special in the first place, was now threatening to destroy them from within. The band was at a crossroads. The final tour for the album Tim became the final act of the original lineup. The shows were more unpredictable than ever. Bob's behavior grew more extreme. There were nights of transcendent brilliance, but they were outnumbered by nights of incoherent noise. The rest of the band, particularly Paul and Tommy, felt they were being held hostage by Bob's self-destruction. The family that Bob had built to save his brother was now turning on him. A difficult, heartbreaking decision was made. In 1986, After a particularly disastrous performance on Saturday Night Live that solidified their reputation for chaos on a national stage, the band quietly let him go. There was no grand confrontation, no dramatic exit. It was a slow, painful freezing out. Bob Stinson, the man who had founded the band, the man whose chaotic spirit defined their very essence, was fired. Bob Stinson's exile from the Replacements wasn't just the loss of a job, it was a profound and terrifying severing of his identity. For a man whose entire adult life had been a shield against a cruel world, the noise that drowned out the ghosts had just been silenced. What followed was not a story of rock and roll redemption, but a quiet, heartbreaking fade into the Minneapolis winter. A man shipwrecked by the storm of his own past. What happens to a man when his reason for being is taken away? What happens when the noise that drowned out the ghosts is silenced? For Bob, this wasn't just the loss of a job. It was a profound and terrifying severing of his identity, his sanctuary, and his only effective shield against a world that had always been cruel to him. The story of what happened next is not one of rock and roll redemption. It is the quiet, heartbreaking story of a man's slow decline, a man left trying to find his footing after the chaos of his past, and present had left him completely adrift. The immediate aftermath was a deafening silence. For the first time in his adult life, Bob had no schedule, no tour dates, no rehearsals to miss. He was cast adrift in Minneapolis, the city where he was a local legend, but now a legend in the past tense. He would frequent the same bars and see the same faces, but the context had shifted. He was no longer the wild heart of the city's most exciting band. He was the guy who used to be in the Replacements. It was a purgatory of his own making, haunted by the success he could hear on the radio but could no longer touch. While Bob was navigating this new, empty reality, the Replacements machine kept rolling, and it moved on without him at a startling speed. They quickly hired a new guitarist, the talented and notably more stable Slim Dunlap, a veteran of the local scene. They went into the studio and recorded Pleased to Meet Me, a sharper, more focused album that earned them the best reviews of their career. The sound was undeniably different. It was cleaner, tighter, professional. The guitars were still loud, but the beautiful, dangerous teetering on the edge of collapse, Bob's signature, was gone. Compare the controlled, classic rock swagger of a song like Alex Chilton with the raw, desperate, and gloriously sloppy yearning of a Bob-era anthem like Bastards of Young. It's not a question of which is better. It's a question of what was lost. The band had traded its volatile, unpredictable energy for a chance at survival, and for a time, it seemed like the right choice. This success was a brutal counterpoint to Bob's life. As the band started to see real money from their major label deal for the first time, Bob was broke, cut out just before the payday. The financial devastation was immense, but the psychological toll was worse. He was forced to watch his brother and his friends achieve the dreams they had all once shared, all while he was stuck in a cycle of aimlessness and depression. He did try to move forward. His most significant attempt was a new band he formed called the Bleeding Hearts. It was his chance to prove that the magic belonged to him, not just to the Replacements. The band was loud, heavy, and raw, a vehicle for the aggressive, blues-drenched rock and roll that Bob loved. And at their best, during live shows in the smoky clubs of Minneapolis, you could see flashes of the old genius. There were moments where he would lock into a groove, his eyes closed, and deliver a solo with all the fire and unhinged brilliance of his peak. For a few minutes, he was Bob Stinson again. But the project was doomed. His reputation for being difficult preceded him, making it nearly impossible to get serious industry attention. More importantly, The demons that had cost him his first band had followed him. His unreliability and the constant shadow of his past made it impossible to keep a stable lineup or build any real momentum. The Bleeding Hearts was less a second act and more a painful echo of what he had lost. This is where the rock and roll narrative definitively ends and a much sadder, more achingly human story begins. Without a band to structure his days, Bob entered the world of regular jobs, a humbling and brutal reality for a man who had been a guitar hero to thousands. He worked as a pizza delivery driver. He washed dishes. For a time, he worked as a cook in a local restaurant. The heat, the noise, the anonymity of the kitchen was a world away from the adrenaline and adulation of the stage. It was in this kitchen that the single most poignant and heartbreaking moment of his life is said to have occurred. As told by those who knew him, Bob was working a shift, likely exhausted and anonymous in his cook's whites, when he looked up at the wall. There, he saw a promotional poster for the Replacements. His former band, his family, now stars without him, their faces staring back at him from a glossy professional world he no longer belonged to. According to his replacement, Slim Dunlap, who heard the story, Bob just pointed at the poster and quietly said to a coworker, "I was in that band." There is an entire universe of loss in that one simple sentence. It's a moment that strips away all the mythology, all the rock star caricature, and reveals the profound human tragedy at the core of his story. There was no anger or bitterness in his voice, only a quiet, devastating sense of disconnection from his own life. It's the voice of a man who recognizes his own past as if it were a movie he once saw, a story about someone else. He was an outsider looking in on his own legacy, a spectator to the life that should have been his. The relationship with his brother Tommy, the very reason the band existed, became one of the most painful threads of this era. Tommy, now a successful rock star, remained in the Replacements. It was a decision that must have been agonizing, tearing him between the loyalty he felt to the brother who had saved him and the forward momentum of his career. A distance grew between them, born of hurt, guilt, and the unspoken complexities of their shared traumatic past. The ultimate tragic irony of Bob's life is that his rescue mission was, in a way, too successful. He had propelled Tommy into a world that, in the end, no longer had room for Bob himself. His health, ravaged by years of relentless alcohol and drug abuse, the desperate self-medication for a lifetime of pain, began to decline severely. Friends and family watched helplessly as he became a gaunt, fragile figure. The larger-than-life whirlwind presence from the stage was gone, replaced by a quiet, haunted man who seemed to be fading away. The laughter and the chaos that had once been his armor were now gone, revealing the deep, unhealed wounds underneath. The central controversy of the Replacement story will always be Bob's firing. Was it a cold-hearted betrayal of a founding member, or was it a necessary act of survival for the band? The truth is, it was likely both. From Paul Westerberg's perspective, the band had reached a critical crossroads. He was evolving as a songwriter, crafting increasingly personal, nuanced, and sometimes fragile songs. Bob's chaotic, let's blow it up approach was becoming antithetical to the very music Westerberg was trying to create. It was a pragmatic, if brutal, decision made by a young man trying to protect his art and hold his career and the careers of his other bandmates together. But on a human level, it remains a deeply unsettling chapter. The band fired the member whose trauma was the foundational spirit of their music. They built their legend on Bob's wild, untamed energy, and then discarded him when that same energy became inconvenient for commerce and art. It felt like a betrayal of the gang mentality, the use against the world ethos that had defined them. It's also worth asking if things could have been different. In a later era, with a greater understanding of addiction and mental health as diseases rather than moral failures, would a band have fired a member in such a state, or would they have staged an intervention and tried to get him into rehab? It's impossible to say. But in the dog-eat-dog world of the 1980s music scene, there was little room for that kind of compassion. Bob was seen as a liability, and he was cut loose to face his demons alone. His legacy, therefore, is a complicated one. As a guitarist, he was a true original. He was an anti-guitar hero in an era of flashy technical virtuosos. He proved that passion, soul, and a kind of brilliant melodic recklessness could be more powerful than perfection. He wasn't just playing notes, he was playing an attitude. He was playing his entire damaged life through 6 strings. His influence is present in every alternative guitarist who values raw expression over polished skill, who understands that sometimes the most powerful sound is the one that's about to fall apart. But his greater, more profound significance lies in his life story. It is a devastating cautionary tale, not about the simple clichés of rock and roll excess, but about the long, dark, and undeniable shadow of childhood trauma. Bob Stinson's life forces us to look behind the curtain of the wild man persona and ask why. Why the self-destruction? Why the constant need to perform, to be the clown, to push every boundary? His story is a tragic illustration of how unaddressed pain and PTSD can manifest, how the coping mechanisms we develop as children to survive can become the very things that destroy us as adults. In February 1995, specifically on the 18th, Bob Stinson, the iconic lead guitarist of The Replacements, was discovered deceased in his modest apartment in the uptown neighborhood of Minneapolis, a city that had long been intertwined with his turbulent life and musical legacy. At the remarkably young age of 35, his passing cut short what could have been a continued influence on alternative rock, leaving behind a void in the punk and indie scenes he helped pioneer. Contrary to the mythic narratives that often romanticize rock stars' demises, with tales of a dramatic, intentional overdose amid excess, the official cause of death was far more subdued and heartbreakingly mundane: acute organ failure. This wasn't a sudden theatrical collapse, but the inexorable culmination of his body's systems, liver, kidneys, and heart, succumbing to irreversible damage accumulated over decades. It represented the slow, sad erosion of a once vibrant physique, ravaged by a lifetime of profound abuse on multiple fronts. As a child, Stinson endured severe physical and emotional trauma from an unstable family environment, including beatings and neglect that scarred his early years and contributed to patterns of self-destructive behavior in adulthood. In the ensuing chaos of his rock and roll existence, marked by relentless touring, substance dependencies on alcohol and heroin, erratic lifestyle choices, and the psychological toll of fame's fringes, Stinson inflicted further harm upon himself, accelerating the physiological breakdown. Autopsy reports confirmed no single acute event, like a massive overdose, but rather a systemic shutdown, a poignant testament to how unaddressed childhood wounds and adult excesses can quietly dismantle even the most resilient spirits. To remember Bob Stinson is to remember the beautiful contradiction he embodied. He was a man whose deepest wounds gave birth to a joyous, liberating noise. He was a fierce protector who couldn't ultimately save himself. He was the clown who wore a dress to hide the scars, the tornado of energy on stage who was, at his core, just a scared and wounded kid from a cold city, trying to keep his little brother safe. His life wasn't a rock and roll cliche. It was a tragedy of survival. He survived a horrific childhood, and the tools he used to do so, the chaos, the comedy, the substances, were the very things that led to his early death. He had built a fortress of noise to protect himself, but in the end, it became his prison. But for a few brilliant, shining years, that noise he created with his brother, his protectorate, was the most beautiful, honest, and gloriously alive sound in the world. He was the soul of the Replacements. And after he was gone, they were never quite whole again. The storm was finally over, and in the quiet that remained was the lasting echo of the beautiful, chaotic music he left behind.